The sketching woman didn't hear Preston Sullivan approach until his horse snorted, and by then he'd been watching her work for the better part of 10 minutes, fascinated by how her hand moved across the paper with such confidence and grace. She sat on a flat boulder overlooking the valley where his cattle grazed, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, her dress dusty from travel, but still maintaining an air of Eastern refinement that seemed utterly out of place in the Oregon wilderness. "That's my land you're drawing," Preston said, not unkindly, but loud enough to announce his presence properly. She startled, nearly dropping her charcoal, and turned to face him with wide hazel eyes that caught the afternoon sunlight. "I'm terribly sorry. I didn't realize this was private property. There were no fences, and the view was so breathtaking I couldn't resist." Preston dismounted, keeping his movements slow and unthreatening. The year was 1882, and women traveling alone in this part of Oregon were rare enough to warrant caution and curiosity in equal measure. He was 32 years old, weathered by sun and solitude, and he'd grown accustomed to his own company over the past 5 years since settling this land outside Wasco. The small town sat in Wasco County, nestled in the high desert country where the Columbia River carved its way through basalt cliffs and wheat fields stretched toward distant mountains. "Wasn't complaining," he said, removing his hat in a gesture his mother would have been proud of had she lived to see him grow into manhood. "Just stating a fact. You're welcome to finish your drawing. I'm curious to see how it turns out." She studied him with an artist's assessing gaze, taking in his tall frame, the sun-bleached brown hair that needed cutting, the dust on his boots, and the honest wear in his clothing. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her concerns because she relaxed slightly and turned back to her work. "Would you like to see what I've done so far?" she asked, and there was something hopeful in her voice that made Preston's chest tighten unexpectedly. He walked closer, leading his horse, and looked over her shoulder at the sketch. She'd captured the sweep of the valley with remarkable skill, the way the grassland rolled down toward the creek, the cluster of cattle near the water, even the distinctive rock formation that marked the western boundary of his property. But there was something more in her rendering, something that showed not just what the land looked like but what it felt like, the loneliness and beauty of it all mixed together. "That's remarkable," Preston said quietly. "You've made it look the way it feels when I ride out here at dawn." She glanced up at him, and a genuine smile crossed her face. "That's the kindest thing anyone has said about my work in quite some time. Most people think sketching landscapes is a frivolous waste of time. Most people are fools." The woman laughed, a clear, bright sound that seemed to roll across the valley like a bell. "I'm Winona Norton. I arrived in Wasco 3 days ago from Boston. My brother runs the new land surveying office in town." Preston introduced himself, and they shook hands with a formality that felt both proper and slightly ridiculous given their isolated location. Her hand was small in his, but he could feel the calluses from holding her drawing implements, the strength in her fingers. "What brings an artist from Boston to Oregon?" he asked, settling himself on a nearby rock. His horse, accustomed to his master's wandering schedule, began grazing contentedly. Winona's expression shifted, something complicated passing across her features. "Freedom, I suppose. The chance to draw what I want rather than what's expected. In Boston, women artists are tolerated if they paint flowers and portraits of children. I wanted mountains and rivers and endless sky. My brother wrote about this country, and I knew I had to see it for myself." "How long are you planning to stay?" "As long as the inspiration lasts," she said, adding more detail to the sketch with quick, confident strokes. "Or as long as my brother's patience holds out." He thinks I should be focusing on finding a husband rather than wandering the countryside with my sketchbook. Preston felt an unexpected surge of disappointment at the mention of husband hunting, which was absurd given that he'd known this woman for all of 15 minutes. "And what do you think about that?" "I think there are more important things than marriage," Winona said firmly. "Though I suppose that's easy for me to say at 24. Most people consider me well past my prime for such things. 24 isn't old. Tell that to my mother's letters. She writes weekly to inform me of all the advantageous matches I'm missing by being out here in what she calls the uncivilized territories." Preston couldn't help but smile. "Oregon's been a state for over 20 years. We're plenty civilized now. Are you married, Mr. Sullivan?" Winona asked, and there was something careful in how she posed the question, as though she was trying to sound casual but actually cared about the answer. "No, madam. Came close once, back in Kansas before I moved west. She decided she'd rather marry a banker than follow me to Oregon. Can't say I blame her. This is a hard life for a woman. Or perhaps it's exactly the right life for the right woman," Winona said, looking up at him again with those discerning hazel eyes. They sat in comfortable silence while she finished her sketch. Preston found himself studying her profile, the concentration on her face, the way she bit her lower lip when working on a particularly tricky detail. He'd been alone for so long that he'd convinced himself he preferred it that way. But sitting here with Winona Norton, watching her transform his lonely landscape into something worth capturing and keeping, he felt the walls around his heart beginning to crack. "It's finished," she announced, holding up the sketchbook. "Or as finished as anything ever is. Would you like to have it?" Preston was stunned. "I couldn't take your work." "Why not? It's your land. Besides, I'll be making many more drawings. This is just the beginning." She carefully tore the page from her book and held it out to him. "Please, I want you to have it." He took the sketch with more reverence than he'd handled anything in years, mindful of smudging the charcoal. "Thank you. I'll treasure it." The sun was lowering toward the western hills, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. Preston realized with a start that he'd spent the better part of 2 hours with this woman, and it had felt like minutes. "I should escort you back to town," he said. "It's not safe to be out here alone after dark." "I have my horse tied down by the creek," Winona said, gathering her supplies and tucking them into a leather satchel. "But I wouldn't object to company on the ride back." They retrieved her horse, a pretty bay mare that seemed well-mannered despite its eastern origins, and rode toward Wasco together. The conversation flowed easily between them, touching on everything from the challenges of raising cattle in high desert country to Winona's observations about Western light and how it differed from the softer, hazier quality back east. "Everything here is so sharp and clear," she said. "The distances are deceptive. What looks like an hour's ride turns into 3, but the clarity of it all, the way you can see for miles and miles, it's intoxicating." "It's lonely country," Preston said. "Beautiful but lonely." "Perhaps that's why it needs artists," Winona replied. "To bear witness to the beauty so it doesn't go unnoticed." They reached the outskirts of Wasco as the last light faded from the sky. The town was small but growing, servicing the ranchers and wheat farmers who worked the surrounding country. Preston rarely came to town more than once a month for supplies, preferring the solitude of his ranch. But as he prepared to bid Winona goodnight outside her brother's house, he found himself already planning reasons to return sooner. "Would you like to come back and sketch the land again?" he asked, then worried he sounded too eager. "I mean, there are other views. The creek runs through a canyon on the north section that's particularly striking in the morning light." Winona's face lit up. "I would love that. Would tomorrow be too soon?" "Tomorrow would be perfect." He touched his hat brim and turned his horse toward home, but he could feel her watching him ride away, and the sensation was both thrilling and terrifying in ways he hadn't experienced since he was a much younger man. Preston spent that evening carefully smoothing out Winona's sketch and placing it on his mantel, the only decoration in his sparse cabin. He studied it while eating his solitary dinner, amazed at how she'd captured something essential about the land he'd worked so hard to claim and cultivate. In her rendering, the valley didn't just look empty. It looked expectant, as though waiting for something or someone to complete it. The next morning, Preston woke before dawn and did something he rarely bothered with. He shaved carefully, put on his cleanest shirt, and even attempted to tame his unruly hair with water and a comb. His reflection in the small mirror showed a man he barely recognized, someone who looked almost hopeful. He rode into Wasco just as the sun cleared the eastern hills and found Winona already waiting outside her brother's house, her sketchbook bag slung over her shoulder and an eager expression on her face. She wore a different dress today, more practical for riding, and he noticed she sat her horse with comfortable competence. "Good morning," she called out. "I've been ready since first light. My brother thinks I've lost my mind riding out with a stranger 2 days in a row." "And what did you tell him?" "That I'm an excellent judge of character and you have honest eyes." She brought her horse alongside his. "Also that if you meant me harm, you wouldn't have spent 2 hours yesterday talking about cattle breeding and the challenges of irrigation." Preston laughed, a sound that felt rusty from disuse. "I suppose that's true, though I apologize for boring you with ranch talk." "You didn't bore me at all," Winona said seriously. "I asked questions because I wanted to know. How else can I understand this place if I don't understand how people make their lives here?" They rode north toward the canyon Preston had mentioned, taking a trail that wound through sagebrush and bunch grass. The morning air was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of juniper from the rimrock above. Preston found himself pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about the land, things he'd never told anyone because there'd never been anyone to tell. "That rock face is where I sheltered during the worst blizzard I've ever seen, my first winter here. I thought I'd die for certain, but I made it through with just my horse and stubbornness. You must have been terrified." "I was, but also determined. I'd given up everything to come here and claim this land. I wasn't about to let weather defeat me." Winona studied him with that penetrating artist's gaze. "You're not what I expected when I pictured a Western rancher." "What did you expect? Someone harder, I suppose, more closed off." "You talk about this land like it's a living thing you're in partnership with rather than something to be conquered." "It is a living thing," Preston said, "and it'll kill you if you try to conquer it. The only way to survive out here is to work with the land, understand its rhythms and respect its power." They reached the canyon, and Preston watched Winona's face as she took in the view. The creek had carved a deep channel through the basalt over millennia, creating walls of dark rock streaked with mineral deposits that glowed rust and copper in the morning light. Cottonwood trees clustered along the water, their leaves just beginning to turn gold with the approach of autumn. "Oh," Winona breathed. "Oh, this is magnificent." She dismounted immediately, pulling out her sketchbook, but then she paused and looked at Preston with something like wonder. "Would you mind if I sketched you, here with the canyon behind you? You're part of this landscape as much as the rocks and trees." Preston felt heat rise in his face. "I'm not much to look at. Let me be the judge of that. Please, I promise I'll be kind," he agreed, feeling self-conscious but also strangely honored. Winona positioned him near the canyon rim, adjusting his hat and asking him to relax, just stand the way he normally would. She worked quickly, her hand flying across the page, occasionally looking up at him with such focused intensity that he felt exposed in ways that had nothing to do with physical appearance. "You can relax," she said after a while. "I'm just adding details now." Preston walked over to where she sat and looked at the sketch. She'd drawn him in profile, gazing out over the canyon, and somehow she'd made him look noble, like someone who belonged in this harsh and beautiful country. It wasn't vanity that he felt looking at her work. It was recognition. She saw him truly, not just as a lonely rancher scraping by in difficult country, but as someone who'd chosen this life and made something meaningful of it. "Is that really how you see me?" he asked quietly. "It's how you are," Winona said, "though I suspect you don't realize it." They spent the morning there, Winona making multiple sketches while Preston sat nearby, occasionally commenting but mostly just enjoying her presence. She worked with such joy and focus that it was a pleasure simply to watch her, to see someone so completely engaged with what they were doing. Around midday, Preston unpacked the lunch he'd brought, bread and cheese and apples, along with a canteen of cool water from his well. They sat on smooth rocks near the creek and ate, talking about everything and nothing. Winona told him about growing up in Boston, the youngest of 4 children and the only one who showed any artistic talent. Her father had been a shipping merchant, successful enough to provide well for his family but traditional in his views about what constituted appropriate pursuits for daughters. "He thought I should learn to paint pretty watercolors and catch a husband," Winona said. "Instead, I kept sneaking away to draw the docks and the ships and the workers loading cargo. My mother was horrified, but you kept drawing anyway. I couldn't stop. It's like asking me to stop breathing. When I draw, I'm more alive than any other time. I see things more clearly, understand them more deeply." "Does that sound absurd?" "Not at all," Preston said. "I feel the same way about this land. When I'm out here, I'm connected to something larger than myself. In town, I feel like I'm playing at being a person. Out here, I'm real." Winona reached over and squeezed his hand, a spontaneous gesture that sent warmth flooding through him. "That's exactly it. That's exactly how I feel about drawing." They sat there holding hands for a long moment, the creek burbling beside them and a hawk circling overhead, both of them aware that something significant was shifting between them, but neither quite ready to name it yet. The days that followed developed a rhythm that felt both natural and precious. Winona would ride out to Preston's ranch each morning, and they'd spend hours exploring different sections of his land while she sketched, and he went about his work. Sometimes, she'd sit on the fence and draw him mending tack or checking his cattle. Other times they'd ride for miles, seeking new vistas and different light. Preston's neighbors began to notice and comment. Jack Davies, who ran the spread to the east, mentioned seeing Preston with a woman when they crossed paths at the feed store in Wasco. "Heard there's an artist lady from back east who's taken a shine to you," Jack said with a knowing grin. "About time you had some female company out at that lonely ranch of yours." "We're just friends," Preston said, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Sure you are," Jack replied. "That's why you're standing here in a clean shirt in the middle of the week, when you usually look like you've been rolling in the dirt." Preston couldn't deny it. He was putting effort into his appearance now, taking time each morning to make himself presentable. His cabin, which had been purely functional, now boasted wildflowers in a jar on the table and his few possessions organized with care. He'd even fixed the shutters that had been hanging crooked for 2 years. Winona was changing his life simply by being in it, and the realization both thrilled and frightened him. He'd built his solitary existence carefully after the disappointment in Kansas, protecting himself from the vulnerability that came with caring about someone. But Winona slipped past his defenses without even trying. her enthusiasm and artistry and genuine interest in his world making him want to open up in ways he'd thought he'd outgrown. 3 weeks after their first meeting, a storm rolled in from the mountains, one of those early autumn tempests that announce the changing season with dramatic force. Preston was checking his cattle when the sky darkened suddenly, clouds piling up in threatening formations that promised not just rain but possibly hail. He was worried about Winona, who'd mentioned wanting to sketch the rimrock formations on the eastern edge of his property. That area was exposed, dangerous in a storm. He urged his horse into a gallop, racing against the weather, his heart pounding with fear for her safety. He found her taking shelter under an overhanging rock face, her horse tied nearby and her sketchbook clutched against her chest to protect it from the first spattering of rain. Relief flooded through him so intensely that he felt weak with it. "Thank God," he said, dismounting quickly. "I was terrified you'd be caught out in the open." "I saw the storm coming and found shelter," Winona said, but her voice was shaky. "Though I admit I'm not used to how quickly weather moves here. One moment it was sunny, the next the sky looked like the end of the world." Thunder cracked overhead and both horses shifted nervously. Preston led them both deeper under the overhang, where they'd be protected from the worst of it, then returned to Winona's side. The rain came down in sheets now, turning the dry landscape into a network of instant streams and rivulets. "We might be here a while," Preston said. "These storms can last hours." They sat side by side on the relatively dry ground beneath the rock, watching the storm's fury. Lightning split the sky, illuminating everything in stark flashes. The temperature dropped rapidly, and Preston noticed Winona shivering. Without thinking, he put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close for warmth. She leaned into him naturally, as though they'd been doing this for years rather than weeks. "I've never seen anything like this," she said. "The power of it, the raw beauty." "It's dangerous," Preston said. "But yes, beautiful too." Winona tilted her head to look up at him, and in the strange storm light her eyes seemed to hold depths he could spend a lifetime exploring. "Preston, these past weeks with you, they've been the happiest I can remember. I need you to know that." His heart hammered harder than the thunder. "I feel the same way. You've brought something into my life I didn't even know I was missing." "What's that, Joy?" he said simply. "Connection. A reason to care about more than just surviving from one season to the next." Winona reached up and touched his face, her artist's fingers tracing his jawline with delicate precision. "I think I'm falling in love with you. I know it's fast, maybe too fast, but I've never been good at pretending or hiding how I feel." Preston had imagined this moment 100 times over the past weeks, lying awake in his cabin at night, but the reality of it was overwhelming in its intensity. "I love you too," he said, the words emerging with a certainty he felt in his bones. "I've probably loved you since that first day, watching you sketch my land and seeing how you understood it." He kissed her then, gently at first, then with growing passion as she responded with equal fervor. The storm raged around them, but here in their shelter, they created their own world, one built on recognition and longing and the courage to admit what they felt. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Winona laughed breathlessly. "My brother is going to have opinions about this." "What kind of opinions?" "Probably that I'm rushing into things, not being practical. He'll want to know about your prospects, your property, whether you can provide for me properly." She paused. "But I don't care about any of that. I care about you and this land and building a life that matters." "I can provide for you," Preston said seriously. "The ranch is successful enough. It's not fancy, but it's stable. And the land will only get more valuable as more people settle in Oregon. But more than that, I'll cherish you. I'll support your art." I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of your love." "You already are," Winona said, kissing him again. The storm eventually passed, leaving the world washed clean and sparkling. They rode back to Preston's cabin together, no longer maintaining a careful distance between their horses but riding close, their legs occasionally brushing, both of them grinning like fools. At the cabin, Preston made coffee while Winona looked around with new interest, seeing it now as a place she might share rather than just visit. It was spare, masculine, clearly the home of a man who'd been living alone for years. But it was also well built and solid, with good bones and potential. "I could paint the walls," she said. "Add curtains, maybe build some shelves for books and my art supplies. It could be quite lovely with some attention." "Is that a yes?" Preston asked, his heart in his throat. "I know I haven't proposed properly, but are you saying you'd consider marrying me?" Winona crossed the room and took both his hands in hers. "Preston Sullivan, I would marry you tomorrow if it were possible, but we should probably do this properly, for both our sakes. You should meet my brother formally, and we should have at least a short engagement so no one can say we rushed into things foolishly." "Even though we are rushing into things foolishly?" he asked with a smile. "Even though. But it's the right kind of foolish. The kind where you know in your heart that this is exactly what you're meant to do, and any delay would be the real foolishness." They agreed that Preston would come to dinner at her brother's house the following evening. Winona would prepare him first, explain the situation, and hopefully smooth the way. In the meantime, they'd continue as they had been, but now with the acknowledged understanding between them that this was leading somewhere permanent. Riding back to Wasco that evening, with Preston escorting her as had become his habit, Winona talked excitedly about her plans. "I'll need a proper studio space. Maybe we could convert one of the outbuildings. And I want to document this whole region, create a complete portfolio of landscapes. We could even submit them to magazines back east, show people what this country really looks like." "Whatever you need," Preston said. "We'll figure it out together." Meeting William Norton, Winona's brother, was more daunting than Preston had anticipated. William was 30 years old, serious and protective, with the careful demeanor of a man who dealt in precise measurements and legal boundaries. He received Preston in his parlor with formal courtesy, but obvious skepticism. "My sister tells me you've been spending considerable time together," William said after the initial pleasantries. "She also indicates that your intentions are serious." "They are, sir. I love your sister and I want to marry her." William studied him with the same assessing gaze Winona had, though his lacked her warmth. "You're a rancher. That's hard, uncertain work. What kind of life can you offer her?" "An honest one," Preston said. "I own my land free and clear, no debts. The ranch supports me comfortably and could support a family. It's not wealthy by Eastern standards, but we'd never want for necessities. More importantly, I respect Winona's art. I won't try to change her or make her into something she's not." "She could have married well in Boston," William said. "Men of means, established families. Instead, she followed me out here against our parents' wishes." "Then perhaps she was meant to be here," Preston replied. "Perhaps she was looking for something those Eastern men couldn't offer." Winona, who'd been growing increasingly agitated listening to them discuss her as though she weren't present, finally interjected. "I'm sitting right here, William, and I'm 24 years old, quite capable of making my own decisions. I love Preston and I'm going to marry him whether you approve or not, but I'd prefer to have your blessing." William sighed, his stern expression softening. "You always were the stubborn one. Very well, but I want a proper courtship period, at least 2 months before any wedding. That gives you both time to be certain and gives me time to make inquiries about Mr. Sullivan's character and circumstances." "That's fair," Preston said, though 2 months felt like an eternity. "And you'll dine with us weekly so I can get to know the man who's stealing my sister away," William continued. "Also, the wedding will be proper in the church with appropriate announcements. Our mother will never forgive me if Winona marries some Western rancher in a rushed ceremony with no family present." Winona rolled her eyes but agreed. "Fine. 2 months, weekly dinners, proper church wedding, but then Preston and I will do as we please." Those 2 months tested Preston's patience in ways that years of ranching hardship never had. Seeing Winona regularly, but having to maintain propriety, suffering through awkward dinners with William's scrutiny, enduring the gossip and speculation of the entire town of Wasco. As word spread about their engagement, it all felt like torture when what he wanted was simply to start their life together. But there were sweet moments too. Winona continued sketching his land, and Preston began to see it through her eyes, noticing beauty in details he'd taken for granted. She taught him about composition and light, about how artists saw the world. He taught her about the practical aspects of ranching, which she absorbed with surprising enthusiasm. "If I'm going to be a rancher's wife, I should know how the ranch works," she said one afternoon while watching him repair a fence. "Show me how to mend this properly." Preston handed her the tools and guided her through the process, standing close behind her, his hands over hers to demonstrate the technique. She was a quick learner, focused and determined, and he loved watching her apply her considerable intelligence to practical skills. They spent hours planning their future. Preston would build an addition to the cabin, creating a proper studio for Winona with north-facing windows for the best light. They'd buy more cattle in the spring, expanding the herd. Winona wanted to start a garden, growing vegetables and flowers. Preston talked about maybe breeding horses alongside the cattle, diversifying their income. "We could have a family too," Winona said one evening as they sat on Preston's porch watching the sunset. "I'd like children if you would." "I'd like that very much," Preston said, imagining a son or daughter with Winona's hazel eyes and artistic temperament. "Though I hope they inherit your talent rather than my rough ways." "Your ways aren't rough," Winona protested. "You're kind and thoughtful and deeply connected to this land." Those are wonderful qualities to pass on. As the weeks passed, William Norton's attitude gradually shifted from skeptical to cautiously approving. He made his inquiries and found that Preston was exactly what he claimed: a hardworking man with a solid reputation and good standing in the community. More importantly, he could see how happy his sister was, how she glowed with joy whenever Preston was near. "I suppose you'll do," William finally admitted to Preston during one of their dinners. "You make her happy, and that's what matters most. Just promise me you'll take care of her." "With my life," Preston said solemnly. The wedding was planned for late November after harvest, but before the worst of winter weather set in. Winona's mother sent money from Boston for a proper dress, along with a letter full of advice and thinly veiled disappointment that her daughter was marrying a Western rancher rather than someone from their own social sphere. But she also sent her blessing, which meant everything to Winona. The town of Wasco embraced the upcoming wedding with enthusiasm. The small community loved celebrations, and a romantic match between a lonely rancher and an Eastern artist caught everyone's imagination. Women helped Winona sew her dress and plan the reception. Men helped Preston make improvements to his cabin, adding the studio space he'd promised, and generally getting the property ready for a wife. Jack Davies, who'd become friendly with Preston over the years, helped him build new furniture for the expanding cabin. "Never thought I'd see you settled down," Jack said while planing wood for a bed frame. "You seemed content being alone." "I thought I was," Preston admitted. "But that was before Winona. Now I can't imagine going back to that solitary life." "That's how it happens," Jack said knowingly. "The right woman comes along and everything you thought you knew about yourself changes." The night before the wedding, Preston lay awake in his cabin, too excited and nervous to sleep. Tomorrow his whole life would change. Winona would be his wife, his partner in building a life on this land he'd claimed. The lonely years would be behind him, replaced by shared mornings and companionable evenings, and someone who understood both his silences and his words. He thought about that first day, finding her sketching his valley, how she'd captured something essential about the landscape that he'd felt but never articulated. She'd been drawing his land, but somehow she'd also been drawing the shape of his loneliness, the vast, beautiful emptiness that needed filling. And now she would fill it, not by changing anything essential but simply by being there, by seeing the land in him with those artist's eyes that recognized what was already present. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, one of those brilliant late autumn days where the sky stretched endlessly blue and the air felt sharp enough to cut. Preston dressed in his best suit, bought new for the occasion, and rode into Wasco with his heart pounding. The church was small but packed with people. It seemed like everyone in town and half the surrounding ranches had turned out to witness the marriage. Preston stood at the altar, his hands sweating despite the cold, watching the door for his first glimpse of Winona. When she appeared on her brother's arm, Preston forgot to breathe. Her dress was simple but elegant, Eastern style adapted for Western practicality, and she wore a crown of late-season flowers in her hair. But it was her face that undid him, radiant with happiness, her eyes finding his immediately and holding his gaze as she walked down the aisle. The ceremony passed in a blur. Preston heard himself making vows, heard Winona's clear voice promising to love and honor him, felt the weight of the simple gold ring as he slipped it onto her finger. And then the minister was pronouncing them husband and wife, and Preston was kissing her while the congregation cheered. The reception was held at the town's largest building, the grain warehouse temporarily transformed with decorations and tables laden with food. People danced to fiddle music, toasted the newlyweds repeatedly, and shared stories and advice with varying degrees of usefulness. "Don't go to bed angry," one old woman counseled Winona. "And make sure he hangs his dirty clothes where you tell him to. Keep her happy and well-fed," Jack Davies told Preston with a wink. "And for God's sake, listen when she talks. That's the secret to a successful marriage." Preston danced with his new wife, holding her close while the fiddle played a waltz, surrounded by community but aware only of her. "Happy?" he asked. "Deliriously," Winona said. "Though I'm eager to get home, our home now." They left the reception as evening fell, riding side by side toward the ranch. The landscape was bathed in golden light, that particular quality of autumn sunshine that Winona had sketched so many times over the past months. But now she wasn't observing it from outside. She was part of it, woven into this place just as Preston was. At the cabin, Preston insisted on carrying her over the threshold despite her laughing protests. Inside, everything was clean and ready, the new furniture in place, the studio addition waiting for her to fill it with her supplies and creativity. Someone, probably Jack's wife, had left a fire burning in the stove and a pot of stew warming for their dinner. "It's perfect," Winona said, looking around with shining eyes. "Absolutely perfect." They ate dinner together, talking and laughing, delaying the moment when they'd retire to their bedroom not from reluctance, but from wanting to savor every moment of this day. Finally, as the fire burned low and exhaustion began to catch up with excitement, they went to bed as husband and wife. Preston had been with women before, but making love to Winona was entirely different. It was tender and passionate, nervous and assured, a physical expression of everything they felt but couldn't quite articulate. Afterward, lying with her head on his chest and her dark hair spread across his shoulder, Preston felt a contentment so complete it bordered on disbelief. "I love you," he said into the darkness. "I'll love you until my last breath and beyond." "I love you too," Winona replied sleepily. "Thank you for finding me that day, or for letting me find you." "We found each other," Preston said. "That's how it was always meant to be." The first months of marriage brought adjustments for both of them. Winona had to learn the rhythms of ranch life, understanding that Preston's work was dictated by the needs of animals and land rather than human convenience. She'd wake to find him already gone in the mornings, out checking cattle or mending fences, or dealing with one of the 100 small crises that arose on a working ranch. But she adapted quickly, finding ways to make herself useful while still maintaining her art. She took over the household management, proving surprisingly capable at the domestic skills her mother had insisted she learn despite her protests. She baked bread and canned vegetables, sewed and cleaned, but she also carved out hours each day for her sketching and painting. Preston, for his part, had to learn to share his space and his decisions. After years of answering to no one, having a wife who had opinions and expectations required adjustment. But he discovered that he liked consulting with Winona, valued her perspective, even on ranch matters. "You should plant trees along the creek," she said one day while sketching the lower pasture. "Cottonwoods and willows. They'd provide shade for the cattle and help prevent erosion." Preston considered it and realized she was right. "That's a good idea. We'll order saplings in the spring." Winter came early that year, and they spent long evenings by the fire, Preston mending tack or doing bookwork while Winona sketched or painted. She was creating a series documenting the changing seasons on the ranch, and watching her work, Preston felt privileged to be part of her artistic vision. "You should submit these to magazines," he said one evening, looking at a particularly striking painting of cattle in snow. "People back east would love to see real images of Western life." "Do you think so?" Winona asked, chewing her lip uncertainly. "They're not very refined." "They're honest," Preston said. "That's better than refined." She took his advice and sent a portfolio to Harper's Weekly, not expecting much response. But 3 months later, a letter arrived offering to purchase several of her pieces and requesting more work in the same vein. The payment was generous enough to make Preston whistle in surprise. "You could make a real income from this," he said, reading the letter over her shoulder. "You're not just talented, you're commercially viable." Winona was thrilled but also nervous. What if this is a fluke? What if they hate the next batch? "Then you'll send them to someone else until you find people who appreciate your work," Preston said firmly. "You have real talent, Winona. The world deserves to see it." Her success gave them both pride, and Preston loved being able to tell people in town that his wife was a published artist. Some of the men teased him about having a wife who earned money, suggesting it somehow diminished his role as provider, but Preston ignored them. He was proud of Winona's achievements and secure enough in himself not to feel threatened by her success. Spring brought new life to the ranch. The cattle produced healthy calves, and Preston's careful management paid off with a productive season. He and Winona planted the trees she'd suggested, working side by side in the warming earth, planning for a future measured in decades rather than seasons. "Someday these will be huge," Winona said, patting the soil around a sapling cottonwood. "Our children will play in their shade." "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Preston asked, his heart leaping. Winona looked up at him with a shy smile. "I think I might be pregnant," It's early still, but I'm fairly certain." Preston let out a whoop and swept her into his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and demanded he put her down before he made her dizzy. "When? How far along?" "I think about 2 months. The baby should come in late autumn, around October." They sat on the creek bank, holding hands and watching the water flow past, making plans and dreaming aloud. Preston had never been so happy. Everything he'd hoped for, everything he'd given up on after the disappointment in Kansas, had somehow materialized in the form of this remarkable woman and the life they were building together. Winona's pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer. She continued her artwork even as her belly swelled, adapting her routines to accommodate her changing body. Preston became increasingly protective, worrying about her overexerting herself, but Winona laughed off his concerns. "Women have been having babies while doing far more strenuous work than painting," she said. "I'm healthy and strong. Stop treating me like I'm made of glass." But Preston couldn't help himself. He hired a woman from town, Mrs. Chen, to come out weekly to help with the heavier household chores. He insisted Winona rest more, take breaks from her work. He was terrified of something going wrong, of losing her or the baby, and his fear made him almost comically overprotective. "I love you," Winona said one evening when he'd fussed over her for the 10th time, "but if you don't let me walk to the garden by myself, I'm going to hit you with a frying pan." Preston laughed despite himself. "I'm being ridiculous, aren't I? Completely, but sweetly so." She took his hand and placed it on her belly, where the baby was kicking actively. "Feel that? That's a strong, healthy child. Everything is going to be fine." The baby, a boy they named Peter, arrived in mid-October during a warm spell that felt like summer's last gift before winter's arrival. The birth was long and difficult, and Preston spent hours pacing outside the bedroom where the midwife attended to Winona, listening to her cries and feeling helpless in ways that all his ranching competence couldn't address. But when the midwife finally emerged with a squalling bundle and told him he had a son, and that Winona was tired but fine, Preston felt like his heart might burst. He went to his wife's bedside and found her exhausted but radiant, holding their baby with a mixture of wonder and fierce protectiveness. "He's perfect," Winona whispered. "Isn't he perfect?" Preston looked at his son, red-faced and tiny and absolutely perfect, and felt tears streaming down his face. "He's incredible. You're incredible. Thank you for this." They spent the next weeks in a haze of exhaustion and joy, learning to care for this tiny person who'd entered their lives. Peter was a healthy baby but demanding, and Preston discovered reserves of patience he hadn't known he possessed. He'd wake in the night to help with feedings, walking the floor with his son while Winona tried to catch a few hours of sleep. "You're a natural father," Winona said one morning, watching Preston change their son's diaper with practiced efficiency. "I half expected you to panic at all this." "I did panic," Preston admitted. "Those first few days I was terrified I'd break him. But then I realized he's sturdier than he looks, and anyway, we're learning together." Winona's brother William came to visit when Peter was a month old, bearing gifts from Boston and news from their family. He was charmed by his nephew and grudgingly admitted that Preston had proven to be everything he'd promised. "My sister is happy," William said to Preston while Winona was putting the baby down for a nap. "Happier than I've ever seen her. You've done well by her." "She's done well by me," Preston replied. "I was half a person before her. Now I'm whole." The years flowed past like the creek running through Preston's land, each season bringing its own challenges and rewards. Peter grew from infant to toddler to sturdy little boy, often following his father around the ranch or sitting quietly while his mother sketched. He had Preston's brown hair and Winona's hazel eyes, and he showed early signs of inheriting his mother's artistic talent, always drawing in the dirt with sticks or arranging objects in pleasing patterns. When Peter was 3, Winona gave birth to twin girls, Sarah and Sophie, who filled the house with chaos and laughter. Preston had to build another addition to the cabin to accommodate their growing family, and the once lonely ranch became a place of constant activity and noise. Winona continued her artwork despite the demands of motherhood, and her reputation grew steadily. Several magazines regularly published her work, and she'd had 2 exhibitions in San Francisco of her Western landscapes. She'd become something of a regional celebrity, the Eastern artist who'd fallen in love with Oregon and stayed to document its beauty. But for all her success, what mattered most to Winona was the life she'd built with Preston. On quiet evenings, after the children were in bed, they'd sit on their porch looking out over the land that had brought them together. "Do you ever miss Boston?" Preston asked one such evening when Peter was 7 and the twins were 4. "Not even a little," Winona said. "That was never really home. This is home. You are home." Preston pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "I still can't quite believe my luck sometimes, finding you that day drawing my land. You became part of the picture, just like you said all those years ago." "We became part of each other's pictures," Winona corrected. "You gave me a life with meaning and purpose. I gave you companionship and love. It was always meant to be equal, this partnership." As the years continued to pass, they watched their children grow and the ranch prosper. Peter developed into a serious young man who loved the land, as his father did, but who also inherited his mother's artistic eye. The twins were wild and exuberant, constantly exploring and getting into mischief, but they also showed signs of their parents' best qualities: Winona's creativity and Preston's steadiness. The landscape changed too, gradually transformed by the trees they'd planted and the care they'd invested. The once sparse ranch became a thriving operation with good water and shade, supporting more cattle and a herd of horses that Preston bred and trained. They'd added more land over the years, carefully expanding their holdings while maintaining sustainable practices. Winona's portfolio of sketches and paintings grew to document not just the land but the life they'd built upon it. She captured Peter's first time on a horse, the twins playing in the creek, Preston silhouetted against sunsets in every season. Her work evolved from simple landscape documentation to something deeper, a chronicle of love and family and belonging. When Peter was 15 and talking about his future, he surprised both parents by announcing he wanted to study art as well as ranching. "I want to understand both sides of what you've built here," he said. "The practical and the beautiful. They're not separate things, they're part of the same whole." Preston and Winona exchanged proud glances across the dinner table. Their son understood what they'd learned. That life wasn't about choosing between practicality and passion, but about finding ways to honor both. The twins, now 12, had their own dreams forming. Sarah wanted to be a veterinarian, fascinated by the animals on the ranch, and determined to learn everything about their care. Sophie showed promise as a writer, always scribbling stories about the West and its characters. "We've raised remarkable children," Winona said one evening as she and Preston prepared for bed. They were both in their early 50s now, their hair showing threads of silver, their faces lined with decades of sun and wind and laughter. "We had good material to work with," Preston said, pulling her close. His body was still strong from years of ranch work, but he moved more carefully now, aware of old injuries and accumulating aches. Winona, too, showed the effects of time, but to Preston, She was as beautiful as the day he'd found her sketching his valley. They made love that night with the easy familiarity of long partnership, but also with the tenderness of people who knew how precious their connection was. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Winona's head on his shoulder, Preston thought about their life together and felt profound gratitude. "What are you thinking about?" Winona asked sleepily. "How lucky I am. How different my life would have been if you hadn't decided to sketch that particular view on that particular day." "It wasn't luck," Winona said. "It was fate. We were always going to find each other. The universe doesn't create love like ours and then let it slip away unused." As more years passed, Preston and Winona watched their children become adults and start their own lives. Peter took over more of the ranch operations, working alongside his father but also bringing fresh ideas and modern techniques. He'd studied at an art school in Portland for 2 years, then returned home to apply what he'd learned to both ranching and documenting the changing West. The twins went to college together, Sarah to study veterinary medicine and Sophie to pursue journalism. They wrote regular letters home, full of excitement about their studies and affection for the family and land they'd left behind. But both promised to return, to build their lives in Oregon near the ranch where they'd grown up. Preston and Winona entered their 60s with the satisfaction of people who'd lived fully and well. The ranch was successful and stable, their children were thriving, and they still had each other. Preston's body showed the wear of decades of hard physical labor, but he remained active and engaged with the work he loved. Winona's hands were stiff with arthritis some mornings, making detailed drawing difficult, but she adapted, working in broader strokes that somehow captured even more emotion than her earlier precise work. They'd become pillars of the community around Wasco, known not just for their successful ranch, but for their generosity and wisdom. Young couples starting out often sought their advice, and Preston and Winona were always willing to share what they'd learned about building a life together in challenging country. "The secret," Preston would say when asked about their long, happy marriage, "is finding someone who sees the world the way you do, or close enough that the differences are interesting rather than divisive. And never taking each other for granted," Winona would add. "Every single day, remember that this person chose you and keeps choosing you. Honor that choice." When they celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary, the whole town of Wasco turned out for the party. Their children organized everything, transforming the ranch into a festival ground with music and food and decorations. Friends and neighbors came from miles around, bringing gifts and memories and testimonials about the impact Preston and Winona had made on their community. Jack Davies, now in his 70s and mostly retired from ranching, gave a rambling but heartfelt speech about watching Preston transform from a lonely bachelor into a devoted husband and father. "Some men are meant to be alone," Jack said, "but Preston was never one of them. He was just waiting for the right woman to show him who he really was." The mayor of Wasco presented Winona with a commendation for her artistic documentation of the region, noting that her work had helped preserve and promote Oregon's unique character. "You came here as an outsider," the mayor said, "but you became one of us in every way that matters. Your art shows the world what we see every day, the harsh beauty and endless possibility of this land." Late in the evening, when most guests had left and only family remained, Preston and Winona slipped away to their favorite spot on the creek bank. The same cottonwood trees they'd planted as saplings 40 years earlier now towered overhead, their leaves rustling in the evening breeze. 40 years, Winona said wonderingly. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday we were standing in that church making promises we hoped we could keep." "We kept them," Preston said. "Every single one." "We did," Winona agreed, "and I'd make them all over again, knowing everything we'd face together." Preston pulled out something from his pocket, a carefully preserved piece of paper yellowed with age. It was Winona's first sketch, the one she'd drawn that very first day of his valley and cattle. He'd kept it safe all these years, occasionally taking it out to remember their beginning. "Look at this," he said. "You captured the loneliness of this place, the waiting quality of it, but you also captured its potential, the sense that it was ready for something more." Winona studied her old work with an artist's critical eye. "I was technically better even then than I gave myself credit for, but I hadn't yet learned to see with my heart as well as my eyes." She looked up at Preston. "You taught me that. You showed me that the most important art documents not just what's visible but what's felt." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. An owl called from somewhere upstream, and cattle lowed softly in the distance. This land, this life, this love, it was all woven together into something complete and satisfying. As they aged further into their 60s and then 70s, Preston and Winona's pace slowed, but their contentment deepened. Peter ran the ranch now, with his parents serving as advisors and helpers as they were able. He'd married a woman from town, a schoolteacher named Marie, and they had 3 children of their own who brought new life and energy to the ranch. Sarah had returned to Wasco after completing her veterinary training and opened a practice in town, living close enough to visit the ranch regularly. Sophie had become a journalist in Portland, but returned home frequently, writing articles about rural life and the changing West that earned her regional recognition. Preston and Winona became grandparents 5 times over, and they embraced the role with joy. They told the grandchildren stories about the old days, taught them to appreciate the land, and encouraged their various talents and interests. Winona gave art lessons to any grandchild who showed interest, while Preston taught them horsemanship and the basics of animal husbandry. "We're building a legacy," Winona said one day, watching her oldest grandson work on a sketch while sitting beside her. "Not just of land and livestock, but of values and vision." "That's what family is," Preston replied. "Passing on not just genes but wisdom, not just property but purpose." In their mid-70s, health issues began to catch up with both of them. Preston had a minor heart scare that frightened everyone, but proved manageable with medication and lifestyle changes. Winona's arthritis worsened, and she had to accept that her days of detailed sketching were mostly behind her. But she adapted, supervising Peter's oldest daughter, Rebecca, who showed remarkable artistic talent, teaching her everything she knew. "You have the gift," Winona told the 16-year-old girl. "But more than that, you have the passion. That's what matters most. Technical skill can be learned, but the drive to create, to capture beauty and truth, that's something you're born with." Rebecca absorbed her grandmother's lessons eagerly, and Winona felt satisfaction knowing that her artistic legacy would continue through her granddaughter. The portfolio she'd built over decades, documenting the Oregon landscape and the life she'd built there, would be continued by someone who understood its importance. Preston and Winona celebrated their 50th anniversary quietly, just family gathered at the ranch. They were in their mid-70s now, showing their age but still mentally sharp and emotionally connected. The party was smaller and less energetic than their 40th had been, but somehow more meaningful, weighted with the knowledge that time was precious and finite. Their children gave speeches, and their grandchildren performed a play they'd written about how their grandparents had met, complete with one of the girls dressed as Winona with a sketchbook, and one of the boys as Preston on a hobby horse. Everyone laughed at the charming production, and Winona cried happy tears. "You've shown us what love looks like. Peter said during his speech. Not the easy romance of courtship, though you had that too, but the harder, more important love of partnership and commitment. You taught us that building a life together means showing up every day, doing the work, and never taking each other for granted. That night, lying in bed in the cabin that had grown and changed so much over 5 decades, Preston and Winona held hands in the darkness. You have any regrets? Preston asked quietly. Not a single one, Winona said. Every choice I made, every path I took led me here to you in this life. How could I regret that? I love you, Preston said, words he'd spoken thousands of times but which never lost their meaning. I love you too, Winona replied. Always and forever. They fell asleep like that, hands intertwined, two people who'd found each other against all odds and built something beautiful and lasting. Preston passed away peacefully in his sleep at age 78, his heart simply stopping after a full, well-lived life. Winona woke that morning to find him gone, and while her grief was profound, she took comfort in knowing he'd died exactly as he would have wanted, in his own bed, on his own land, beside the woman he loved. The funeral brought people from all over the region. Preston had been respected and liked, known for his integrity and fairness in business and his devotion to his family. Stories were shared about his generosity, his wisdom, and above all, his profound love for his wife and the land he'd claimed and cared for. Winona mourned deeply but with grace, supported by her children and grandchildren. She continued living on the ranch, in the cabin they'd shared, surrounded by memories both painful and sweet. She couldn't sketch anymore, but she spent hours looking at her old work, remembering the days they'd spent together documenting the land and their life upon it. Tell me about grandfather, Rebecca would ask, sitting with Winona on the porch in the evenings. And Winona would tell her stories about a lonely cowboy who'd found a woman sketching his landscape and had the courage to speak to her. About a man who'd seen past her Eastern origins to the person she really was. About building a life together in challenging country, raising children, weathering hardships, and celebrating joys. He made me part of his picture, Winona would say, and I made him part of mine. That's what love is, I think. Finding someone whose vision of life aligns with yours well enough that you can create something together more beautiful than either could alone. Winona lived for 3 more years after Preston's death, years spent surrounded by family and the land they'd loved together. She saw Rebecca graduate from art school and begin her own career documenting the modern West. She watched her grandchildren grow and start making their own choices about life and love. She saw Peter's careful stewardship ensure the ranch would continue thriving for generations to come. When Winona died at 81, peacefully in her sleep like Preston before her, it felt like a completion rather than an ending. She was buried beside her husband on a hill overlooking the valley where she'd first sketched his land, where he'd first spoken to her, where their story had begun. The family erected a simple monument, inscribed with both their names and a single line. They found each other, and in finding each other, found home. The ranch continued to thrive under Peter's management, and eventually passed to Rebecca, who combined her artistic vision with practical ranching knowledge in ways that honored both her grandparents. She continued Winona's work documenting the landscape, but she also added something new: portraits of the ranch families through generations, showing how the land shaped the people and the people shaped the land. In Rebecca's studio, carefully preserved in climate-controlled frames, hung Winona's original sketches, including that very first one of the Lonely Valley. Visitors to the ranch, which had become something of a pilgrimage site for Western art enthusiasts, would stand before that sketch and hear the story of how a lonely cowboy had found a woman sketching his landscape, and how she'd become part of the picture, and how together they'd created something that transcended both landscape and portraiture to become a document of love itself. The cottonwood trees Preston and Winona had planted grew old and massive, providing shade for cattle and humans alike. The creek still ran through the property, though its banks were stabilized now by generations of careful management. The cabin had been expanded so many times, it was barely recognizable as the sparse bachelor quarters Preston had once inhabited. But the original structure remained at its core, preserved deliberately as a reminder of origins. On summer evenings, Peter and Marie would sit on the porch, just as Preston and Winona had done, watching the sun set over land that had been in their family for over a century. They'd tell their grandchildren stories about great-grandfather Preston and great-grandmother Winona, about how they'd met and fallen in love and built a legacy that extended far beyond property or possessions. "Love like that is rare," Peter would say. "But it's possible if you're brave enough to reach for it when it appears." And the children would listen, absorbing lessons about courage and commitment, about seeing beauty in harsh country, about building something that lasts not through force but through careful attention and genuine care. The story of Preston and Winona became family legend, passed down through generations, each retelling adding new details or emphasizing different aspects, but always returning to the central truth. A lonely man and a questing woman had found each other in unlikely circumstances and had the wisdom to recognize what they'd discovered. They'd built a life together that honored both their individual strengths and their shared vision. They'd faced challenges without losing sight of what mattered most. They'd created art and family and legacy, leaving the world richer for their presence in it. In the end, Winona's sketch had been prophetic. She'd drawn a landscape that was beautiful but incomplete, waiting for something. And Preston had provided what was missing, not by changing the landscape but by giving it context, meaning, and purpose. Together, they'd become part of a larger picture, one that included children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, one that extended across decades and generations, one that proved love and land and legacy could combine into something transcendent. The lonely cowboy had found the sketching woman, and she had indeed become part of his picture. But more than that, they'd created an entirely new picture together, one that continued to evolve and develop long after they were gone, a living artwork made of land and love, and the enduring power of two people who'd had the courage to reach for happiness when it appeared before them.